visit to Oman later on today, which means that Saif has to go. And so what we're going to do is reorder the session and first deal with, if you like, the closing remarks, then have this very important session, which I think may be the highlight of the meeting, focused on the issues of trust in science. And then I'll make a very brief closing remark after that to complete the meeting. So pretend we have had the session on trust in science and we're closing the meeting, and then we'll reverse it after that. First of all, I have a message from Her Excellency, the Minister of Science, Higher Education, Research and Innovation, who apologises that she cannot be here this afternoon. She will be here tomorrow morning at our meetings tomorrow and with the ISC meetings, but she particularly wanted me to acknowledge all of you and say that they are delighted with all of you coming to Oman and hope that you can see this high level of commitment that Oman has to use science and innovation to develop a country in this part of the world. And we have here today my close friend, His Excellency Saif Al-Hadadabi, the Under-Secretary for Research and Innovation, who's been my partner and our partner for several years now in moving towards both the global dialogue and, of course, the General Assembly meeting tomorrow of the International Science Council. There are many scientific conferences, so why did we have the Global Knowledge Dialogue? Well, we set it up, the International Science Council set up the Global Knowledge Dialogue as a rolling series of meetings where we did not do a deep dive into scientific issues in themselves, but tried to have a deep dive into the issues of how science and policy, science and diplomacy interact. We started in Cape Town, we followed it in Kuala Lumpur, and now then in Santiago de Chile. And now we're here, and by having it associated with the International Science Council, we hope that it's not just having regional impact, but can have global impact as well. Such meetings have many functions, local, global functions. They allow us to create new networks. We all know that three-dimensional meeting is more effective than two-dimensional meeting. They create the collegiality that underpins science in the end. Because as we've been talking about throughout this meeting, there are tensions in the world. They're tensions that are beyond our ability to control. But the collegiality that underpins scientific collaboration often can maintain relationships where other parts of society cannot. In a moment, I'm going to ask Salvatore, because my voice is going, the result of spending 24 hours flying to get here, I suspect, to read out the declaration that you've all contributed to. Now, we all know that declarations have multiple reasons, but the major reason is to be a tool to remind us of the event, the collegiality, the ethos that binds us together, and the general issues that science must face, be they the tensions and the politicisation of science, the issues of trust and distrust, which we'll discuss in a few minutes in the next session, the relationship between science and other knowledge systems, the shifting axis of science in the world, to the east, to the south, growing equity in science. We're seeing a far more diverse range of actors. We've talked about the pluses and minuses of technology, the issues of sustainability and climate change, and all their dimensions. And we've talked about the geostrategic tensions, what will be possible for science, how will science remain as open as possible in a time of greater securitization. These are all the issues that we've talked about. Now, we cannot talk about them in a declaration and have a unanimity of views. So the declaration is more just an aid memoir that we've met, and secondly, to assist our hosts in their own remarkable journey. It's been a remarkable journey for those of us who've been coming to Oman for several years to see how Oman has grown and grown its economy, its people, its commitment to sustainability, which is long-standing. The late Sultan Qaboos Prize as a memorial to a country that recognised the importance of environmental science many decades ago and continues to be awarded by the World Science Forum every few years. So, because my dear friend Saif will go in a few minutes, I want to acknowledge him once more. On behalf of all of us, will you please communicate to all the leaders in Oman our gratitude for what you have done to support the ISC and the commitment you've now made to have an office here and to continue the work of the ISC in this region. There's one other person, if you don't mind, I want to particularly thank, and that's my dear friend Yusuf Al-Baluchi, who has done so much for so long. He's a fellow of the ISC, and Yusuf has helped us navigate sometimes rocky waters to make sure that we've got there. So I'm now going to ask Sal to come up and read what is a simple declaration, which I don't think should be as problematic as earlier versions, and then I'll ask you to accept it by acclamation, and then ask Saif to make one or two few words, and then we'll move to the next part of the symposium.
Good afternoon. Let me go through the declaration, which is also being projected. Preamble: the Global Knowledge Dialogue is an initiative of the International Science Council to periodically consider key issues the science society and science policy interfaces. This edition was convened jointly by the ISC and the Ministry of Higher Education, Research and Innovation of the Sultanate of Oman. The International Science Council's global membership brings together 250 international scientific unions and associations, national and regional scientific organizations, including academies, government agencies and ministries, research and science councils, international scientific federations and societies, young scientific organizations. Recalling that the vision of the ISC is of science as a global public good, meaning that scientific knowledge and its practice should be universally considered as shared resources from which everyone should be able to benefit. Recognizing the diversity of ambitions, challenges, opportunities, and approaches in science globally, the growing disparities in research capacity and quality of education between countries and regions, and the need to address these gaps to foster global progress. Recalling that to realize its vision, the mission of the ISC is to provide a robust, effective, and trustworthy global voice for science. Considering that the global context in which science is done has changed significantly in the last decade, and that emerging technologies are further changing the paradigms of scientific research. Noting that in this context science has a key role to play in promoting social justice, peace, security, and sustainability. Considering the role of the ISC in strengthening the voice of scientists and their diversity, advancing their freedom and safety, and promoting the right to participate in and benefit from science. Let's now move on to the actionable statements of the Declaration. Participants in the Muscat Global Knowledge Dialogue, therefore, defend and promote the free and responsible practice of science by advancing the right to participate in and benefit from science, and more broadly, upholding the role of science as a global public good. Maintaining cross-border scientific collaboration in times of tensions and crisis. Supporting the protection of science ecosystems and scientists in emergency and conflict settings, with particular attention to displaced scientists. Supporting the free, safe, ethical, inclusive, accountable, and equitable conduct of science. Stimulate and support international inter- and transdisciplinary collaborations in scientific research and scholarship on issues of global concern, including by actively supporting the UN International Decade of Sciences for Sustainable Development as a tool to advance the sustainability agenda. Mobilizing for the International Polar Year 2032-2033 and the UN Decade for Cryospheric Sciences, taking a holistic approach that integrates all formal and applied sciences, natural, medical, social, humanities, engineering sciences, as necessary in addressing these complex challenges. Encouraging the pursuit of research on inequality and social cohesion, including gaps where science can play an effective role. Calling upon funding organizations, philanthropic entities, and leading scientific institutions worldwide to take proactive steps in supporting under-resourced regions by investing in capacity building activities, in capacity building initiatives. Working collectively to develop practical solutions to prevent or reduce pollution and achieve the vision of zero emissions. Contribute to the fair evolution of science systems in the context of emerging technologies and global inequalities, including by engaging with science and research funders, policymakers, and other relevant stakeholders to provide expert guidance on the transformation and reform of science systems in, for example, open science, research assessment, and science publishing, and the enhancement of their transparency, efficiency, inclusion, and integrity. Promoting a transformation in the higher education institutional environment by equipping future scientists globally with the necessary transdisciplinary knowledge, tools, and skills to tackle urgent and complex societal and environmental issues. Critically evaluating the potential impacts of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies on multiple facets of science and education systems. Ensuring that scientific data is generated, stored, managed, and accessed in a way that facilitates the address of cross-domain grand challenges. Supporting academies and associations of young scientists. Continue advocating for the value of science and promoting evidence-based understanding and decision-making at all levels. Promote capacity-building initiatives, appropriate training, and adoption of principles and models to strengthen science's role in the multilateral system. promote and assist the use of science diplomacy to advance the common good and address global challenges, advocate for the growth and maintenance of investment in international science programs and free and open knowledge sharing. Encourage the contribution of scientific research and innovation to the goals of global peace, human well-being, planetary stewardship, and global sustainability. Reiterate the importance of improving the representation of women scientists and underrepresented groups in the governance of scientific organizations and in science endeavors in general. And finally, conclude that science is a universal endeavor that can act as a positive force to bridge divides, foster trust, and catalyze collective action on shared global challenges at multiple levels. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Actually, I'm not prepared to give a speech, but this is really the right moment, at least, to say a few words. And as we are getting really to close the Muscat Knowledge Dialogue, first I would like really to thank everyone who contributed actually in this discussion. The wonderful discussion actually that took place over the 2 days here in Muscat. And I want to thank each one of you actually for the valuable contribution throughout discussion and shared vision for the future of science. We discussed actually a number of issues like trust in science, science diplomacy, and the future of science. And of course, over the past 2 days, we explored challenges, celebrated breakthroughs, and laid the foundation for meaningful collaboration. And science, of course, thrives on cooperation. And I think we had one of the parallel sessions on collaboration. And I think this is really the moment where we celebrate collaboration physically. Like what Sir Peter mentioned, that I mean we are not meeting on 2D, but we are meeting as a 3D actually domain, and even beyond that. The ideas that has been exchanged and the meeting actually has affirmed the power of coming together. It's really wonderful. Of sharing knowledge and discussing several aspects of science and the power of science in tackling issues and complex issues such as the emerging technologies of AIs, the sustainability, and the role of science actually in diplomacy and decision making. Of course, our discussions don't end here. In fact, they spark the momentum for action and the continuation of partnership. And that's why actually we have laid the foundation of a regional office here in the Sultanate of Oman. And we hope that this office actually will play a role in the region, basically covering the Middle East and North Africa. So let's take what we have learned, strengthen our networks, and ensure that the solution we pursue, like we have proposed actually in the Muscat Declaration, are as ambitious as the challenges that we face actually over the global world. Thank you for your dedication and to advance actually science. And we look actually for another 2 days of the meetings of the International Science Council General Assembly here in Oman. And also please enjoy your stay here in Oman, especially those who came for the first time. And please do not miss the Friday trip to Nizwa. And also to the Oman Across Ages Museum. It's really a wonderful place, and you will be able to see parts of Oman as you drive from here to Nizwa on Friday. Enjoy your stay, and I would like really on behalf of the Ministry of Higher Education, Research and Innovation, and on behalf of the Sultanate of Oman, to thank you and to welcome you again and again here in Oman. Thank you for this contribution and wish you really a wonderful stay in Oman. Thank you. Thank you.
Those of you who know me know that if you go out to dinner with me, the one thing I like is a dessert. And so while we formally closed the agenda, we now have the real dessert, and that is to have a discussion on a matter which I think has come up in every session in the meeting and in many of the informal discussions that I've been in. And that is, we'll now have a session led by two good friends of mine, Anna Marie Arabia from the Australian Academy of Sciences and Peggy Otambotang from the African Academy of Sciences, with a panel on that fundamental issue. How do we maintain in a difficult world trust in science? So enjoy your dessert.
Thank you very much, Sir Klockman. Thank you for introducing this session so eloquently. It is true that this is very important, session, and the last plenary. Good afternoon, Excellencies. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon, experts. It is my pleasure to co-chair this very important plenary with my colleague, Anne Maria Arabia. I'm sure that most of you would have been part of 3 plenaries, and either 3 or as many as the 9 side events. And all of them touched on trust in science. So this closing plenary will debate science as a universal endeavor, which is positive force to bridge across divides and foster trust and collective actions on shared global challenges and set the scene for ISC's work in the years to come. I won't belabor the point, but I just want to, connect this session to the Global Declaration of the 2024 World Science Forum. There were a number of recommendations, but I would like to single out one of them. And this declaration calls on scientific community to redouble their efforts to ensure the production of trusted knowledge and pragmatic solutions, and to eliminate harmful scientific practices in both the production and the reporting of knowledge. So it is within this context that this last session, or this last plenary, was couched. But as a reminder that trust is fundamental for cooperation and collective action. Trust is fundamental to the conduct of science itself. And the erosion of trust in science and in institutions more broadly require urgent and collective actions, such that the International Science Council needs to be a major actor in global governance to help meet these responsibilities, as eloquently indicated in the last conclusion, that we need to renew the urgency, prepare for disruptions, roadmap transformation, meet the needs of most vulnerable, acknowledge and counter inequalities and injustice, meet the pace of challenge with knowledge, governance, and partnerships. But above all, we must work at multi-scales to foster understanding, respect, collaboration, and joint action. So this plenary with eminent experts will try to answer a few questions. And these questions border on, are there regional differences, in the way we engage in science and scientific information? In a context of increasing misinformation and disinformation, what role can the scientific community play to ensure that robust scientific information is promulgated in ways that enhance trust? And what are the implications of the delivery of scientific advice at the global level, national levels, and also regional? And what role can science and other knowledge systems play in supporting collective action on global issues? There are two parts of this plenary. The first will be a keynote by Dr. Hugo Messier, a research director at the Institut Jean-Nicole in Paris in Evolution and the Social Recognition team. Dr. Hugo has expertise in cognitive mechanisms that use humans to reason and evaluate. In addition, we'll have a panel which will be led by my colleague, Anne-Maria Arabia, also Executive Director of the Australian Academy of Sciences, will lead the panel discussion. And on the panel, we have His Excellency Olafur Ragnar Grimson. Yep. We also have Sir Jeremy Farrer. We have, Jeremy, because of time, he was connecting online, but he has to disconnect because of the time. So apology from him. We have Dr. Abdul Monin Al-Hassani, Julia Maton Lefebvre, Dr. Lucia Fernanda, and Fernanda King, and Professor Robert J. Graft. They will be able to answer some of these questions. Without much ado, may I call upon our keynote, Dr. Hugo Messier, to try to answer some of the questions on what is trust. What are the factors affecting trust? Why is trust so important in relation to the role of science in policy and in society, which we have discussed in the last 2 days? And what do we know about the extent to which science is trusted globally? Without much ado, may I please invite Dr. Messier to give us the keynote. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So you probably don't need to be convinced of this, but trust in science matters. It's always better to check whether it's actually the case. And one of the best studies that has been done, I think, in that respect is a paper by Yann Algan and his colleagues who've asked in a number of countries during the pandemic how much people trusted science and how much they trusted the government and how much they trusted each other. And they also asked how much people were willing to comply with COVID-related restrictions, such as masking or distancing, and whether they would be willing to be vaccinated against COVID. And they found that trust in science was by far the strongest, and it was quite a strong predictor of these COVID-19 related behaviors and attitudes in a way that was much stronger than trust in government or trust in each other. So it seems to work. Trust in science matters. We find similar patterns when it comes to... Oh, sorry, I have to... Is that loud enough now? It's very loud for me, so I can't really tell. Thank you. We find a similar pattern for trust in science and belief in climate change, for instance. The good news is that people tend to trust science. We have now two very large studies that have been conducted on that topic. One by the Wellcome Trust, the Wellcome Global Monitor project in 2018 with 140,000 participants in 140 countries. And they summarize the data on trust in science in this scale of how much people trust science, with high, medium, and low level of trust, or people who just don't know what science is. And across the world, overwhelmingly, people trust science at least a medium or a high extent. There are interesting variations between regions, but in just about everywhere, most of the people who know what science is will tend to trust it. There are some substantial minorities who don't and that are interesting, but the majority does. And the second main data point we have now is a recent study by Victoria Colonia, Niels Smide, and their 200 colleagues in 68 countries, asking a lot of questions about trust in science and in scientists. And to summarize their results in this scale between 1 and 5 in terms of trust in science, they find that the average is about 3.6 and every country is above average. So then again, on the whole, people have a positive trust in science. If we look at trends, we have much less good data on trends, but it seems as if anything, trust in science is increasing in the world. Again, the best data on that is from the Wellcome Global Monitor, who did another survey in 2020. And here I'm going to present the share of people who say that they trust science a lot. And in 2018 will be the blue bar, in 2020 the yellow bars. And you can see that in just about every region of the world, trust in science has increased in these 2 years. Except like the main exception is Sub-Saharan Africa. Keeping in mind that the 2020 data point was during COVID, so the results might be amplified because of this. But if there is a trend, it's a positive trend. There's only one country for which we have really long data, and it's just flat, because essentially, as you see, the science education hasn't changed that much. So we have data on trust in science in the US for about 50 years. And there's really no trend at all. Like, you can't ask for a flatter regression line. Technically, the trend is minus 0.00026 by every year. So in the next, geological age, maybe we'll have to worry about this. And we have a cute study with some colleagues showing that trust in science is even stronger than this. So we've asked participants in the US, about maybe 600 of them, 10 basic science knowledge questions, such as, are electrons smaller, larger, or the same size as atoms? And then after they had answered the question, we told them what the correct answer was, and we explained to them very briefly why that was the case, and we provided them links to reliable sources. And then we asked them, do you accept this scientifically consensual answer? And then we divided the participants by groups in terms of how much they said they trusted science. So people who said they trust science a lot, they have quite a lot of science knowledge, so they got the questions right reasonably well, even though chance is at like 40%, so it's not as high as it looks, but still quite well. People who trust science a bit less, they got a bit less science knowledge, and so on and so forth. But then we look at whether people, whether they were right or wrong, would accept the scientifically consensual answer. And so, unsurprisingly, people who trust science a lot accept just about everything about basic science that we ask them about. People who say they trust science to some degree also accept everything. People who say they don't really trust science also accept everything, and people who don't trust science at all also accept everything. And we also had a sample of people who were completely convinced that the Earth was flat. They also accepted 95% of the information. So there is this, I mean, in every educated society, there is this kind of basis of trust in science, which is quasi-absolute. Why? Why do people trust science? It's not because they are currently very knowledgeable about science, because they're not. People don't know a lot about science. Like the questions that we've asked earlier as an example are very simple questions, and even the most educated participants got a lot of them wrong. So, you know, obviously previous speakers brought about the question of science literacy, which is dramatically low. So it's not that. The account I will sketch here now is an account we're working on with some colleagues, which we could dub the kind of the rational impression account of trust in science. And it goes something like this. When people are exposed to science, they are impressed. They are impressed by some of the content, by the explanations, by the arguments, by the experiments that scientists have performed. They are also impressed by the fact that scientists have managed to agree on things that are very hard to know. So even if you don't know how they've done it, the fact that scientists have a good idea of the age of the universe or how cells work, it's really very impressive. The fact that this bunch of people have managed to agree on something that is so difficult to know is in itself a very rational reason to believe that they're right and to believe that they're competent, even if you don't know how they got there. And so what happens is you're exposed to this scientific knowledge, and then you're impressed by it, but then you forget just about everything you've learned. And it's not, but you maintain the impression, the positive impression of science. So to give you an analogy, if you have a computer problem and one of your colleagues fixes your problem, you might not understand how they did it, you might forget what exactly the problem was that they fixed, but you will remember that that guy is good at fixing computers. So we tried to test that account in a number of ways. In a series of experiments, we provided participants with impressive information about a science, like not science on the whole, because people have kind of priors that are too strong. So for instance, we told participants a bunch of information such as archaeologists can tell the age at which someone dead for thousands of years was weaned, which is pretty awesome. So we have a lot of kind of impressive information about archaeologists, and after receiving that information, people are impressed by archaeologists, they trust them more, and a few minutes later, they've forgotten just about everything they've read. But they still trust archaeologists more because they were impressed by what they were able to do. Another prediction of that account is that people should trust science more the more they have been exposed to it. And indeed, the main channel of exposure to science is science education. Like you receive hundreds of hours of scientific content, whereas most adults really barely consume any science. And indeed, the main determinant at the global scale, the main determinant of trust in science is science education. So again, that's data from the Wellcome Global Monitor. So the scale is on trust in science from 1 to 4. And you can see this very strong linear increase of how much there's the standard, like the confidence intervals of the model. But there's a very strong linear increase with the science education of how much people trust science. Another thing that we can derive from this model is that some sciences are more impressive than others, and people should trust these sciences more. I mean, they should, you know, it's a prescription of the model, it's not a normative should. For instance, we asked a bunch of French participants how precise they thought different sciences were as an estimation of how impressive they found these sciences and how much they trusted the sciences. And there's a very strong positive correlation between these two things. So people find that physics and biology are very precise, and also they trust them a lot. People think that sociology and economics are less precise and they trust them less. We did not ask about psychology because I'm a psychologist and I didn't want to know. But you know, it sort of makes sense. So how can we use this to try to increase trust in science? And I think what this account does is provide a justification for measures that are quite commonsensical. So we should increase exposure to science. So through science education and science communication. And importantly, I think we shouldn't despair when things don't stick. Like, you've received like hundreds and hundreds of hours of science education, and then you test, adults 20 years later and they've forgotten everything. It's not ideal, but in terms of trust in science, it's maybe not that big a deal. What's good is that people say that scientists, so that's also from the Colonia and Mede big paper, overwhelmingly people say that scientists should communicate with the public. If you look at people's behavior, they don't consume that much science communication, so I think they're saying that, but I don't know how much they really want to consume that information, but at least, they want us to provide it for them. And the last thing is obviously we should just make better science, because, at the end of the day, people are impressed by very good science through some, complicated channels, but they end up being impressed by that science and trusting it. And just to give you just an example of how much better we can still do, this is a graph I've kind of stolen from Our World in Data, showing the results of clinical trials in a bunch of kind of heart-related diseases in the US. So the gray line is the risks in the experimental group compared to the control group. And the dots are the reduction if they're blue, or the nothing if they're gray, effects on the risks of the drug that is being tested. So as you can see, it looks as if up to the year about 2000, most clinical trials are blue, and so they reduce the risks of strokes and heart attacks and other bad outcomes. And then in 2000, the FDA mandated that clinical trials had to be pre-registered. So before running a clinical trial, you have to say what you're going to do exactly, what drug you're going to test, what are the outcomes that you're going to look at. And after that, nothing works anymore, really. So it seems as if a lot of what we were seeing before was noise and kind of selective reporting of clinical trials. And a few things worked, and then you can be quite confident that these things actually work. So science keeps improving, and essentially our job is to keep doing that. And at the end of the day, if we do good science and we communicate about it, people will end up trusting it. That's the conclusion. People broadly trust science. They do so even though they don't know a lot about science, they don't understand a lot of science. I would argue that it's still a rational process. It's still rational for them to do science, that they use rational heuristics to arrive at that trust in science. And that the more impressive the science is, the more trust it receives. So we should just keep creating more impressive science. Because I'm French, I have 5,000 people to thank. I want to thank the CNRS for paying my salary, ENS for giving me an office, ANR for paying for my research, Institut Nico for providing me with colleagues, Jan Vander for doing all the research that I'm taking credit for. And thank you, our fantastic hosts. Thank you, all of you, for listening to me. And this is my address if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Messier. That was a wonderful beginning of our dessert degustation, but there is much more with a very distinguished panel with us this afternoon. I'd like to direct my first question or invite to speak His Excellency Olafur Grimsson. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. As Chair of the Arctic Circle and former President of Iceland, you will have seen fluctuations in trust. You will have seen how science is used in a range of decision-making forums and how important maintaining trust in the work of scientists is. Could I ask you to share your experience as a former head of state and chair of the Arctic Circle on what the role of science is, the role it's playing in international relations, and how science can be an effective bridge builder in a region like the Arctic with contested geostrategic interests and rising environmental pressures? Do we not? No microphone? We cannot.
So maybe you can sit
I
there,
see.
I'll stand.
We have an echo issue.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't know who you call. No, and I thought I had very good ears. Hi, I'm Julia. I heard so much about it. It's impossible to hear here. Yeah.
So the echo from up here is significant, and our lovely panelists are unable to hear the question. So if I'm here, is that better? Fantastic, excellent. So.
We understand a few words.
Because eco is not that.
Right. So, His Excellency Grimson, thank you for being part of this distinguished panel. I was hoping you could reflect on your experience as a former head of state and chair of the Arctic Circle on what role science is playing in international relations and how science can be an effective bridge builder in a region like the Arctic with its contested geostrategic interests and rising environmental pressures. His Excellency.
Well, I must admit, due to the acoustics in the situation, that I have extreme difficulty getting every part of your question. So if you can come here and summarize it, because by using the microphone, I don't get any sense of what your question was. I apologize for that. Well, let me try to summarize my experience in this. But let me first say that I started my career as a professor at the University of Iceland and cooperated in the early European attempts to get scientific cooperation among the new generation of political scientists in Europe. And then I entered the political world with that scientific experience. And in the last 10 years, I've founded and led the Arctic Circle, which has become the largest annual international gathering on the Arctic, where scientists, diplomats, political leaders, entrepreneurs, indigenous leaders, and others come together. And the major lesson of this journey is that it's extremely difficult to keep science somehow pure from the political winds and the thunderstorms and the tectonic shifts in the world. So this goal or vision which we all have, that somehow we can make science a pure commodity, not contaminated by the real world or the political conflicts or the authorities and the ruling circles in different parts of the world, is extremely difficult, extremely difficult. And unfortunately, we now live in a world, at least in the western part of the world, where geopolitical conflicts and wars have almost built insurmountable barriers between scientific communities. So I think it's extremely important in this discussion to be concrete and not avoid the hot potatoes and the political sensitive subject, because it's very tempting to seek refuge in general analysis and general presentation of the role of science and community and public goods and so on and so forth, where the reality is we face extraordinary barriers and threats. And in order to deal with that, scientists have to be courageous enough to step out of our protected areas and openly challenge the authorities. We all know the saying, speak truth to power. It's an old saying, speak truth to power. I think the challenge for present science is, do we have the courage to speak truth to power? And international science organizations, universities, and others, for them and for us, it is a big, big challenge. And I give you a concrete example to illustrate this. A good friend of mine, an elderly Finnish professor, who was probably the foremost Arctic professor in the Nordic countries, went to an innocent, non-political meeting in Russia last year. And this led to his university stripping him of his status as a professor emeritus. When we have come in my part of the world to a territory where universities on their own start punishing people for interacting with others, we have reached a very dangerous spot. So my message is simply this: we need courage. We need courage. And without the fundamental courage, it doesn't matter how many international conferences we have, how many institutional frameworks we build up. We have to be willing to speak truth to power. And I tell you from my experience, having been both in the political world and the science world, it is an extraordinarily difficult challenge. Extraordinarily difficult challenge. But without it, I fear that the international world of science will be divided up into political territories with very little interchange between each one of them.
Thank you very much. I'll just come closer. Dr. Abdul Amuniam Al-Hassami, thank you for being on the panel. Professor of Communications at Sultan Qaboos University and former Minister of Information here in Amman. You have had a very distinguished career and experience both as a policymaker and as a scholar. What are the factors affecting trust in science, and how can we ensure that science is shared in ways that enhance trust from your perspective?
Thank you, moderator. First of all, I'm very proud to be here. I came from social sciences background, and my major is journalism studies, which is interestingly that scientists don't trust this major until the 60s of the last century. And still until now, many of them, they don't believe on journalism. Let's talk about the factors actually that affects trust. I have read many studies until now shows that the trust is still there. Trust of science and scientists is still there. But during crisis, this trust will be under question actually. So, crisis of trust after the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, it was a major issue in many studies. But what are the main factors that affect the trust of science and scientists? There are many actually, but I classify them in three main measures, three main factors. First of all, value alignment, which people, when they think that their concerns are not reflected in scientific research, they will start for not trust or not believe in science or scientists. For example, if society that understudy there are many major problems like drugs or alcohol problems or increasing of students out of schools or many other problems, but the studies showing different other problems. Here, the public don't believe on science or science research. The second factor is new media. New media now plays major factor actually in affecting the trust of science and scientists. And the political parties, for example, influential companies, many other powers in societies, they take advantage of new media to portray their opinions. So here they use the media and play it very well to actually present their opinions. Here, the science and scientists through new media will be untrustable. The third factor, conflict of interest. Personal characteristics, individual or groups, may affect also trusting science, especially in crisis. So these three main factors, from my opinion, and they are of course shown in many other studies, that affect trusting science. So in this situation, what the role of the scientific community in a context of increasing misinformation and disinformation? And again, as I said, from journalism background, there is an increasing of misinformation and disinformation, not just in one country or society, but at the whole in general. Here, without, of course, accurate information, the public in general cannot obtain the right decision in any field of life. However, of course, misinformation and disinformation lead a wrong path. However, this is in general, and we saw as a case, and there are many studies shown case of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, that misleading information, misinformation, disinformation, especially about the vaccine, that shown untrustable information here. For example, that they spread information which is false information, but also harmful information that shown the vaccine will change the DNA, for example. And it was spread in the whole world. Or many other misinformation during the pandemic. And this will make, of course, science and scientists untrustable. The problem here is not just the case itself, but also the specialists, the scientists themselves, sometimes will spread some information that untrustable. For example, in their publication, in bias of citing or sampling that not cover the society, this will lead to unclear information for the public. That's why there's a term called infodemic during the pandemic of COVID-19. So the role of the scientific communities, universities, organizations, forum, research groups, etc., I put them in 5 main points here. First of all, scientifically cooperative. We have to cooperate, all of us. We cannot work individual. So that's why this kind of forum is very important. The second, we have to make international accreditation, not just for the universities, but also for research councils and other research forums. The third one, or the third point here, evaluating the information in general. And the fourth one, information verification centers, is very important for any information. At the end, the future challenges here that despite of the international cooperative in science, nevertheless the future using misinformation and disinformation are increasing gradually actually because of the, what we call it in media, easygoing tools of new technology and media. So this makes organizations such as the ISC take more responsibility to strengthen the trust in science and support scientists, younger scientists, to do more research in trusting science. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abdul Alassani. I'll now turn to Julia Martin-Lefebvre. Lovely to have you with us. I'm absolutely delighted to meet you in person, actually. Julia, you have many affiliations, including Chair of the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement and Chair of the Board of the Villas Institute Foundation, but previously, of course, former Executive Director of ICSU, Director General of IUCN, and you played a very critical role chairing the ISC's strategy in its engagement with the multilateral system. So the role of the ISC and its members in a range of matters is not unfamiliar to you, and especially not in policy making. Central to that, of course, is trust in science. What are examples to learn from on how science has come together to deliver policy and positive outcomes? And what role can international non-governmental communities play in global policy making?
Is it on? Thank you very much. Thank you it's a real pleasure to be here. I did start my career at ICSU, so I feel very much at home. So first of all, I want to say that I'm really glad that the word trust is in this panel title. Sometimes people think it's a little fluffy, it's not very scientific, but without, in my view, without trust, without systems thinking, systems approaches, leadership, and clear communication, we can't get anywhere. So I'm very much in favor of this, that's why I accepted. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story of my career, not because it's an ego trip, because I'm very much against that. I think everybody should leave their egos outside, along with their acronyms, their logos. But I think it's an interesting story. How did it happen? My first job was, and I was very young, was in the United Nations at a big program on environmental education, which follows up from the session we just had about science education. But somehow or other, maybe I was too young, but there was so much competition in the UN system in those days. Let's hope it's changed a lot. There was a lot of mistrust. I was hired by the United Nations Environment Program, but placed rightly so at UNESCO, which is the education part of the UN. A lot of competition, lack of trust between those organizations. Let's hope that's changed, and if not, you have to help it change. Then I had the next break, which was a big break for me, to become Deputy Executive Director of ICSU, and then later on, not too far away, and not too much later, I became the director. I have to say that I was the only woman in a sea of males. That has changed, but I think one story I should say here is that it wasn't, I was always encouraging my female colleagues, but I think I went through that glass ceiling without noticing it, which I think is the best way to move. Just be good, be yourself, and there is space for women. Thank heavens things have changed since then. one thing is that I came, a little bit like you, I came to ICSU not with a degree in a specific area of science that all the unions knew about, but with a degree in environmental policy. And I managed to convince ICSU that this was important. It was the existential challenge already then, how to understand the climate issue, how to understand the loss of nature, our life support, how to bring these together. So one thing, of course, I did not succeed in is to include the social sciences. That was a failure. It was perhaps too early. Luckily, the ISC was born in 2018. We did realize that the planet would be just fine without us. So we needed to understand us, and that was we needed the help of the social scientists. And the ISC is doing that now, but it's something that still needs a lot of attention, how to bring these disciplines together. So on the global scene, ICSU became the trusted partner and advisor to the 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development, which was held in Rio de Janeiro. I hope some of you still remember that. We were invited, in fact, I was invited because I was the person who understood about environmental policy making, to become the senior advisor to that system, ICSU as such. And I convinced, it wasn't too complicated, but I did need to speak to truth to power, as you said. I did need to convince ICSU that this was a worthwhile activity, taking us a little bit out of our silos of the different disciplines and the different national members of ICSU, and working very closely with the UN system on the Rio conference, which was called the Earth Summit. So ICSU provided the chapter on science and environment and development in Agenda 21. Now that was a long time ago, but it really was an important step for ICSU based on trust and based on courage, I'm coming back to you, to undertake work that wasn't the typical ICSU agenda. I have to just tell you that I want to just read something from the then president of ICSU. Those of you who know India would remember this name, M.G.K. Menon, a very, very distinguished scientist and a former Minister of Science and Education. And he spoke to the governments in Rio. And what he said really resonates with this session. He said that, that science was ready to forge partnerships with other sectors of society, recognizing it is transformations that bring about sustainable development. So already calling for reaching beyond your discipline, beyond your country. So I think this effort to get to know individuals, get to talk to them, start to learn their language is so important in trust building. I have to say that the next thing that I did was I don't believe that anybody in a leadership position, as much as you love it, should stay beyond a certain period. So I accepted the offer to lead a program on leadership for environment and development. This was a very interesting program funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. I didn't have to fundraise, that was very nice. And the idea was to find mid-career people from different sectors of society to help them with their leadership skills. We have thousands of people who are proud to call themselves lead fellows. I could tell you stories for hours. One of them, who we headhunted and found, was a climate scientist, and she's just been elected president of Mexico, for example. So this was a very important part of my growing up in the science and trust-building world. And the next thing I accepted was a little strange if you look at my CV, but I accepted to become the rector of the UN-created University for Peace based in Costa Rica. Costa Rica has no army. It was the best place to be. The reason I accepted this, again, trying to cross over disciplines, is that being in the science world and in the environment world, we were more concerned about, let's say, digging a clean well in a village, but we never thought that what happens to the woman who walks for miles and miles to get that water, what happens to her? What is her security issues? So under my leadership, that university started an environmental security master's program. And finally, to just
finish with my story, I became the head of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which was founded, ICSU was a part of its founding in 1948 with a very brave design, and that is to include governments and NGOs as the members, 1,600 members. All of your governments are members, and many, many NGOs, big and small. This was said to be the most complicated international job, and I kept it for many years, and it was an important experience to bring this multi-sectoral group together. It's still something that's going on, but I think ICSU and the ISC, after all, through the national academies, you are linked to governments, and that is important in policy making. So just to say that I think the messages that I would bring here is networking, getting to know each other. I've really enjoyed my bilateral conversations with many of you, getting to know each other. That helps build trust. One of the former presidents of ICSU, Dr. Jane Lubchenco, many of you might know her. I remember at a Tyler Prize ceremony, she said, "We scientists all have to be bilingual." Everybody was very nervous because many people only do speak one language. What she meant by that is speak your language, whether it's English, French, Hungarian, which is my mother tongue, but also learn to speak clearly to get messages across. So again, this clear communication is so important, and especially important from the scientific communities, where we don't have in our education system the importance of how to get our messages out, how to understand why science is so important. That's why I really enjoy listening to you, because there is a lot of false information going around the world. But if we, the scientists, can explain things based on good science, but make sure you are aware of the person sitting across from you, does that person understand? Thank you.
Thank you. Before I introduce our next panellist, please have your questions ready. I will be coming to you after 2 more contributions, so we'd love as many questions from the audience as possible. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Luisa Fernanda Escudero King, I'm sorry if I've mangled your surname, who's Director of Diplomacy and International Scientific Cooperation at the University Simón Bolívar in Colombia. Scientific and technological capabilities remain very unequal between countries and regions, and this undermines the capacity to have equitable conversations and collective action on global challenges. Given your experience in Latin America and the Caribbean, what role can science diplomacy play in this regard?
Thank you. And in fact, scientific and technological capabilities remain really unequal between countries and regions, and that's a situation that we really suffer, especially in Latin America. When we talk about this region, Latin America and the Caribbean, these inequalities limit the local progress and hinder equal participation in international conversations and the collective action needed to solve common challenges that we have also with other regions. This also leads to problems, of course, such as trust in science. That's a problem that we also have. And science diplomacy has a crucial role in mitigating these inequalities and transforming the region into a key player on a global stage. Latin America and the Caribbean face significant challenges in their scientific capacity, and that's a situation that we can see across the region. According to UNESCO reports, the region invests an average less than 1% of its GDP in research and development. This is far below the global average. In addition, there is a marked concentration of scientific resources and capabilities in some countries in the region, such as Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. And other nations face significant difficulties due to a lack of infrastructure, trained human resources, and stable funding. All these has a direct impact on the issue of trust in science. Another situation that we face, and I think that's common also with other countries in the global south, we can discuss that further in the open discussion, is the topic of the brain drain situation. So, and this is a challenge where a high percentage of researchers trained in the region end up working in countries in the global north due to better job opportunities and research conditions. This situation perpetuates internal inequalities, also regarding trust, and limits the region's ability to develop local solutions to global problems. So, science diplomacy in Latin America seeks not only to close these internal gaps that we have regarding capabilities, but also trust. And we want also to position the region as a relevant actor in global discussions. As some of you know, we have here some representative also from our regional focal point of the ISC in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we are working really hard from our local point to work together with academies of science, with science unions, with governments to advise regarding all these topics that we have in the ISC, also the topic of the trust. Although science diplomacy is gaining recognition in the region, it still faces challenges regarding its understanding and application in the real life. Many people still, many scientists also, still struggle to understand how can science diplomacy have an application in my real life, in my everyday life. Especially also regarding this trust situation. In many cases, it is perceived as an activity limited to international relations or the works of scientific elites, which reduces its potential impact. To change this perception, it is essential to promote a more inclusive vision of science diplomacy, involving not only governments and universities, which in our region are important actors of science diplomacy. Also the universities are important actors in science diplomacy activities, but also civil society, private sector, and local communities, and of course, our scientific unions, our scientific associations that we have in the region, part of the ISC and that are not part of the ISC as well. So science diplomacy has also a lot of, how we say, interesting examples in the region. For instance, the work of the Inter-American Institute for Global Change. I have been working with them also in several activities that I think are very interesting regarding these trust situations. And we work together with scientists in order to publish recommendations for governments and for also communities. For instance, for the conservation of the Amazonia, we have published a working paper on that last year. And also we have published a policy brief on the topic of the conservation of mangroves, because in Latin America we have a lot of mangroves. So those are examples of what we can do, not only to gain more understanding of the situation in the region regarding these key topics for us, biodiversity, for instance, but also it is very important that we publish those kind of working papers or documents, because they support us as scientists in the issue of trust. I wanted to point out also something which I think is very important, and is the scientific diasporas and its role when we think about trust in science. Some countries in the region, such as Argentina, Chile, have their own diaspora promotion activities, and they have demonstrated how scientific diasporas can mobilize and strengthen local capacities. So when we strengthen the local capacities, we support trust in science, and this is something that I wanted really to point out, because in the Global South, we have still a lot of problems regarding the scientific capacities. And when we think on the topic of the scientific diasporas, the initiatives that they can do include, for instance, the creation of networks of researchers abroad, temporary or permanent return programs that allow scientists to contribute to the development of their countries of origin without losing their international connections. And we need those international connections. When we think about diasporas, we think about the diasporas with the brain linkage approach. So we want to circulate knowledge between the North and the South. So, and just to sum it up, I think we are doing some work in the region regarding capabilities, regarding the capacities, regarding strengthening the networks, working together with governments, but still there is a lot to do. And science diplomacy has supported us, of course, a lot in the work regarding especially collaboration, because we are more interested in collaboration rather than competition in the region. So when we support science diplomacy in a region such as Latin America and the Caribbean, we create these international networks. And we start to translate this scientific knowledge into effective policies. And this supports us, this building bridges. No? We have talked about a lot about building bridges, no? Between local needs and global challenges. And we need those bridges for trust, but also for the construction of a more just and sustainable world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The balance between collaboration and competition has come up again and again over the course of the last few days. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Robert de Graaf, the President-elect of the International Science Council and, of course, former Minister of Education, Culture and Science of the Netherlands. Professor de Graaf, in the context of geopolitical shifts and major global challenges requiring collective action, what is the role of science as a global public good, and how can we make that happen? Just a small question.
Well, thank you for that question. And let me start by recognizing incredible, powerful, positive energy, coming from this gathering. I really want to thank our gracious and very generous host, the Omani government, for bringing us all together. And I think it's a great pleasure to see not only all disciplines, nations, regions, generations coming together. I think we are very fortunate as a scientific community to live in a part of the world that is converging, whereas there are so many divergent forces. And it's a great pleasure and honor for me to play a role I see in the future. I must say, perhaps at this point in the conversation, we reached the point that everything has been said, but not yet by everyone. But I want to perhaps highlight 2 points. The first is that, scientific cooperation is very obvious from the point of science itself. I'm a particle physicist, and obviously this is a global community. I must say it helps to have one accelerator together. But the issues that we discuss here, how science connects to policy, to society, how our architecture of science has to evolve, how do we engage the younger generations, how do we engage the public at large? I think we spend much less time and energy in exchanging practices in those fields. And I think there's a huge opportunity to expand on this. I can tell you from my experience in government that many governments and policymakers suffer from the N=1 syndrome. There's only one copy of your country. You feel you're totally unique. This is actually not true. I think we can learn a lot by comparing these experiences. And of course, it's difficult to build bridges from a scientific community that's rational, that believes in win-win, that thinks long-term, often across many generations, and thinks from a global perspective, to a world that's often zero-sum, emotional, and very short-term. But I think actually we can do this. The second element, I feel, and it was very beautifully illustrated by the presentation, is that all these issues are also important research questions. So there's a famous saying I like very much where Steven Weinberg, the Nobel laureate, a physicist, said, you know, often in science we learn more about the world, about ourselves, but now and then in science we learn something about science, how science works, how science can be improving. And I think this is terrific strength, particular of the ISC, that we have the social science, the humanities on board to help answer these kind of fundamental questions. Now I think finally, you know, it's an easy prediction that not only science will progress, and we see even more exciting results, but that the impact of science on the world will become bigger and bigger. And science will be everywhere in our lives, and that then asks a very important question: how can we increase the adhesive power of science so that actually it also gets absorbed by society and is not rejected? And I feel again that the presentation was very encouraging. You know, there might be a general decreasing, you know, appreciation of institutions and trust in institutions, but all happiness is relative, and I think, you know, as scientists, we're still in a relatively good position. And I think that gives us, you know, a great responsibility that we actually have to work on this. And I think actually, again, you know, this is an issue that we can only solve to bring all the different components together. I would say all the strands that weave the fabric of science. The national strands, the disciplinary strands, the generational strands have to come together. And I think actually that's, you know, where we put much more effort and energy in the future.
Thank you so much. You're absolutely right. In a very complex environment we live in, we should celebrate and harness the high levels of trust we still enjoy and not take them for granted in any way. Now over to you, to our audience. If there are any questions, please pop your hand up and a microphone will come your way. So I see two at the front table there. And if you could please say your name and your affiliation. And panelists, if you can't hear the question, we'll try and repeat those.
Can I speak? Marcia Barbosa. I am the Vice President elected for the International Science Council. My question is, the studies show that people have confidence and trust in what they call science without understanding an argument. This means that a common person, you have a confidence when someone tells them that vaccination gives you autism, if you call this science. Should you worry about?
Okay, thank you very much. We'll take a couple of questions and then we'll ask the panelists to answer. Any more questions?
Yes, please. I'm from Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
Saroj Jasinga. Geopolitics and conflicts cast long shadows over trust in science, as seen in the example of politics surrounding the Arctic Circle. Yet, can science truly claim moral high ground when its innovations are weaponized to fuel global conflicts and violence? Can global science plead innocence when its breakthroughs power the engines of war and devastation? Should the International Science Council confront this profound ethical dilemma or chicken out? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. You want to take it? Yeah. More questions, yeah. Did you hear the question? Was it clear enough?
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
I'll just try on the second question, if I may, and that is, it's a very good question, and we have had conflict in every generation. Things are pretty bad right now. But I think looking back at the history of ICSU way before my time, those big global programs, including on the International Polar Year, the International Geophysical, from what I understood when I read a lot about ICSU before accepting its offer to come and be the director, that those programs were really designed to bring people who, from countries which didn't talk to each other, certainly didn't trust each other. So it was a very willful way of designing programs that, and I think that's what the ISC should do also. We need to bring those human beings together, not necessarily their governments right now, but the individual scientists. And that trust building from those, and there are many other examples, but from those examples continued, not that conflict was stopped, but at least it was made possible to communicate and to talk to each other. So that's one experience that I would like to say. It was a very important question.
Perhaps I can say something about the first question, which is really interesting, which was the conclusion that people base their trust not so much on really understanding the science. I think that's a good thing, because science will become more complicated, more involved, etc. But the way I read that result is the trust is based on understanding how science works. So I think that actually creates wonderful opportunities, particularly for education. You can learn children, young students, the scientific method. And I think if society understands that these are the practices and principles along which science work, they will, and they base the trust, so to say, on the strength of this internal architecture. That might be a good thing without knowing the fine details, because it would be totally impossible. In fact, if the whole world would understand the details, then we don't need science anymore, right? We don't need experts. So I think this is, in some sense encouraging, but it's also, I think, shows where the vulnerabilities are. Because I think in the same way, results which are, create distrust because it's sloppy research, it's not according to standards, that actually not so much questions this particular result, but it again questions the general methodology of science. So I think what I read from this is that, in terms of communicating, it's important that we also not only communicate the results of research, but also communicate the practices and procedures, because actually that is the one thing that will, in some sense, is universal. It will stay with us, and it will also produce the future results.
Okay.
Thank you. So it's great, obviously, if people know more about the methods of science. I guess it's also important for people to communicate accurately, for journalists, I guess, or science communicators, to communicate accurately the state of consensus within science. So if something is really well established and all the specialists agree on it, then you can just talk about it, no problem. If that's not the case, I fear that when people read a scientific result, they will assume that it's consensual if they're not told otherwise. And if that result actually is just supported by a few researchers or one school of thought or something, and then it turns out to be completely mistaken, then trust in science might suffer in the long run. So I think it's important to be transparent about how consensual results are, because I think the trust in science is built to some extent on that, the fact that scientists agree with each other, which is amazing that they managed to do that, because we know we don't like to agree with each other by default. So the fact that it's kind of forced on us is quite impressive. And so it's important to portray that. You don't have to have a poll for every result you convey, but to give us the reader a sense of how consensual it is, I think is quite important.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. You've had the personal, interventions, experiences, and also what do we want to see, and how do we want International Science Council driving this trust in science? We need to work together, but we also need to have the courage. Somebody has to speak up, as Excellency said, but most of the time we're too quiet. This is time for us all to be courageous, to say what is right and at the right time. Thank you. I think we have a hand. Yeah. So,
this
an
is the...
apology. Maybe you should speak a bit louder because there's so much echo here and we can't hear.
Okay,
So, yeah,
this is Dr. Aftab Ahmed from Pakistan. And I actually, there is a wonderful discussion so far, but few of the points about the modern age and the current age and the future and the trust in science we should also take care. For example, there are three things. One is the misinformation, and in the present era with the technology, with so many social media tools, we know that the misinformation, they travel 10 times faster than the true information. So how to tackle that? That's one thing. Another is the pseudoscience. So there are also so many like popular lectures, which is not the science, but the pseudoscience. And for the true lectures, you may have 500 views, but the pseudoscience lecture, you may have like 500,000 views. So that's another big issue. The third issue in the era of AI, when we go to ChatGPT and other search tools, so people now like not going to search the things, but go to these tools and ask the questions there. For example, whatever information they need, they go to these AI tools. So how much they can trust these tools? And should we like trust those, or we should go to the experts? So I think these are the modern age challenges that we should. I'm also like, I'm a scientist, but also in the like professional of science journalism, because I host a radio show. And these are the things I often like face in Pakistan. For example, one of the example I can give, the polio is a problem in just 2 countries now. And there is a lot of mistrust still in the polio vaccine. And that is due to these like misinformation, false information, and so on.
All right. Thank you for the comment. Any more? Yeah, okay.
Jeffrey Wilton, member of the IRC Governing Board. Don't you think, and I should transpose this into a question, don't you think that the phrase trust in science is far too simplistic? It hides more than it exposes. For example, it's important to distinguish between trustworthiness and trust, and the two are different. How much of the science we present in published form is trustworthy and isn't dishonest with fake data and fake information? Some would say it's as high as 30%, some might say it's as high as 40%, 50%. In other words, if you ask the question, is science trustworthy? The answer may be no, it's not. If we then come to trust, if it isn't trustworthy, you shouldn't trust it. On the other hand, even trustworthy science cannot be trusted sometimes. Just one example, just almost 20 years ago, I was involved in trying to produce a single hydrograph for the Mekong River. Now, if the Mekong River had been running through one country, then we'd have produced a hydrograph very simply. Unfortunately, it runs through 6 countries: China, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. The problem there was that we had 6 hydrographs because some countries take water out for irrigation, for dams. In other countries, there's net increase of water to the river. And it's taken 20 years, and we still don't have a single agreed hydrograph for the Mekong River. Going back to Olafur Grimson's comments, it's one of those cases where scientists are leaned on by their governments and agree to say something which they know isn't right. Science sometimes needs guts, and the question is, where can the guts come from? Could it come from a body like ISC?
Thank you. We have a hand up there. Yes? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Ben Ahunu from Ghana. Perhaps to build on the last speaker's concern and maybe a little departure. Can science be trusted? Yes, it can. But can the scientist be trusted? Because the information put out there is put out by a human being. And in recent times, there has been a week of withdrawals of published articles from renowned and leading publishers or journals. The fact that it's science, the true science, can identify the false information and bring them out for the publisher or the author to withdraw, in itself assures me that science can be trusted. It's the scientists who put it out there who cannot be trusted. But the true science, yes, will find the odd ones out. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. You want to take it, Hugo? Because you gave why we need to trust science, and you gave some data, but he's asking, is the scientists who don't, who are not trusted. And the other comments about, do we still need to trust in science?
It is a funny place to have to defend the trustworthiness of science. I didn't realize I had to do that, but so indeed a lot of papers are problematic. A lot of papers are also never cited, so let's hope that there is some overlap between the papers that are problematic and those that are never cited. On the misinformation question, it is the narratives around misinformation, it's something I've worked on very extensively, are widely exaggerated. That 10 times faster is just completely bogus. It's just not what the paper shows at all. Misinformation is usually between 1% and 3% of the information people consume, and it's all consumed by a range of people who are specialized in that. So it's really not, it's a symptom of deeper issues that are worrying, but in itself it is not a large problem for societies. And I think, I'm a social scientist, and I even think that social science can be trusted to some extent, and I really trust the hard sciences, so if you tell me I'm wrong, I'm just going to be very disappointed.
Thank you. Maybe Your Excellency, you want to answer that? We still need to know? Okay. Yeah.
On the second part.
Okay.
Yes. When you were saying the thing about if we as scientists could be trustworthy, I think that's a very good question and a very sincere question. And I think that's a question that every one of us should ask ourselves, okay? Especially when we have been talking about a lot of also open science, open data, and there is still a lot of problem with that, with open data sets and stuff like that. We have talked a lot also within this event about the importance of transdisciplinary approaches and the co-creation of research with participants and the real dialogue with the participants and the new role of the participants within science. And I think that's one of the ways that can support the better understanding of science. Concepts also such as popularization of science, citizen science. In Colombia, we talk about apropiación social del conocimiento, which is a little bit different of popularization. It's more like co-constructing science with the communities. And I think that's something that we should do more, especially in the South, in order to create more trust.
I just want to talk about the spread of misinformation, disinformation, misleading information. All of these stuff actually spread like fire. And this is very obvious, of course, but our destiny here is to fight against this false information because it's harmful, it's because it's affect our style of life in general, health or economy, political in general. That's why it's very important for any organization or university or research centers to have information verification center inside each of these information and to follow and correct all of these mistakes every time. This is what we can do, at least at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there's a last. Okay.
Very
So
small.
we have last one, burning question
mine-
out there. Yeah, please.
I think, Mr. Chair, mine is just a statement of thought in the future. Really, this is an extremely important subject. My name is Ratemo Micheka, the president of the Kenya National Academy of Sciences in Nairobi, Kenya. I just have a suggestion. Thank you very much for the speaker's excellent explanations. Could we take this subject to our own academies? This is an important, difficult subject to tackle and make even a statement on it now or at any time. Every country has issue of mistrust, distrust, information coming even from the developed nations who have developed some compounds come and say this is wrong, and then the rumors that go around the nation in various dialects, in various languages, make mountains of those discoveries. To me, we go back to our academies, discuss them. Next time we meet, we must have a whole day of live examples of what goes on worldwide when it comes to trust in science and trust on innovation, madam. I thank you and wish you happiness.
Okay, thank you very much. On that note, I think we have to come to the close of it. I would like you all to join me in thanking our experts who have left this very well, given their, experiences, calling on all of us to work together. And we need to have the courage. May I have a round of applause for the panelists, and then I hand over to my my co-chair and my president.
Well, that brings the Global Knowledge Dialogue to a close. We closed it unofficially a couple of hours ago, but we've closed it now. But if I could just comment on this last session. A few weeks ago, the ISC, jointly with the European Commission through the Joint Research Centre, had a meeting in Ispra where both Hugo and I were present, where we spent a lot of time on the issues of trust in science. And the report from that meeting is just being commented on by all the participants at the moment, and there'll be a published report coming out of the two-day workshop, which Hugo was one of the major speakers at in Ispra a few weeks ago, and which I co-chaired with the Deputy Director of the JRC. Just to remind you that while the Knowledge Dialogue has closed, the General Assembly of the International Science Council starts tomorrow afternoon, and tomorrow morning there are a large series of informal meetings of our members and others. There's a category 1, 2 and 3 members each meeting separately, as are the young academies. There's a meeting of prospective member organisations. There's a meeting of affiliate bodies. There's a number of regional organisation meetings, regional focal point meetings, meeting of the unions, meeting of the ISC fellows. So there's lots of meetings tomorrow morning which are informal, and we'll have the formal start of the General Assembly tomorrow afternoon. Once again, I want to thank all of you who participated in the forum, and we would like feedback because we continue this series of, I'm not sure where the next edition will be, but we'll continue the series of meetings. Thank you very much and have a good evening.